At my daughter's wedding, I caught her telling her wealthy mother-in-law, "She's a pathetic failure, nothing like you." So during the toasts, I stood and played a message her deceased father had recorded before he died. The entire room fell utterly silent. You know, there are moments in life that just shatter everything you thought you knew. For me, that moment came at my own daughter's wedding, when I overheard her tell her rich new mother-in-law, "She's just a pathetic failure. Nothing like you." Can you imagine? I stood there, my heart absolutely crumbling, and in that instant, I knew I had to do something drastic. My name is Dorothy Williams, but most people call me. I'm 68 years old, and up until a few weeks ago, I truly believed my daughter Sarah respected me. Turns out I was wrong about a lot of things. The wedding itself was everything Sarah had dreamed of since she was 12. Picture this: the Ashford family estate in Connecticut. Manicured gardens, a mansion straight out of a movie, 200 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, and enough flowers to stock an entire florist shop. Michael Ashford's family had money, the kind that goes back generations. And Sarah? She'd landed exactly what she'd always wanted. I'd driven up that morning from my small apartment in Hartford, wearing a navy dress I'd bought just for the occasion. It wasn't designer, but it was respectable. Or so I thought until I saw the other guests. The women wore clothes that cost more than my monthly rent, diamonds that could blind you, and that particular look of untouchable confidence that comes with never having to check your bank balance. Sarah, though, she looked absolutely breathtaking. She wore her grandmother's vintage Chanel dress, the same one I'd carefully preserved for 40 years. The same dress I wore when I married her father, Frank, back when we were foolish enough to think love was all you needed to build a life. She'd insisted on wearing it, and I, the naive fool that I was, thought it meant something sentimental to her. Oh, how wrong I was. The ceremony? Perfect if you like that sort of thing. I sat in the second row, right behind Sarah's college roommate. Patricia Ashford, Michael's mother, sat in the front, dripping in pearls that probably cost more than my car. She'd been politely cold to me since we first met 8 months ago. That particular kind of coldness, you know? Wrapped in good manners, but it cuts just as deep. Later, during cocktail hour, I was standing near the terrace doors. The music was playing, guests were mingling, but then I heard Sarah's voice. She was talking to Patricia near the flower arrangements, probably thinking the music would cover their conversation. But I've always had excellent hearing. A blessing and a curse, as any mother will tell you. "Don't worry about her," Sarah was saying, and I saw her glance in my direction. My blood ran cold. "She's just a pathetic failure. Nothing like you. She's never accomplished anything worthwhile. I mean, she worked at the public library for 30 years. Can you imagine anything more depressing?" Patricia nodded approvingly. "Well, at least she knows her place. Some people from simpler backgrounds can be so pushy about inserting themselves where they don't belong." My hand tightened around my champagne glass. Simpler backgrounds. As if dignity and hard work were something to be ashamed of. My mind flashed back to the double shifts I'd worked to put Sarah through college. The sacrifices Frank and I had made so she could have music lessons and summer camps and all the opportunities we'd never had. That's when I remembered the letter in my purse. Frank had given it to me a week before he died, with strict instructions. "If Sarah ever treats you badly," he'd said, his voice weak but determined, "you read this out loud. Promise me, Dot. She needs to hear what I really thought about some things." I'd carried it with me ever since, never imagining I'd actually need to use it. But standing there, listening to my own daughter describe me as a pathetic failure, to a woman who saw me as beneath her notice, I realized Frank had seen something coming that I hadn't. He'd been watching Sarah change during his final months, and he hadn't liked what he was seeing. The reception dinner was a blur of forced smiles and small talk. I was at table 8, strategically placed far enough from the head table to be out of sight, but close enough to avoid obvious exile. My dinner companions were distant relatives of Michael's, making polite conversation about the weather while carefully avoiding any questions about what I did for a living. I picked at my salmon and watched Sarah work the room like the politician she'd always wanted to be. She graduated from Yale with a degree in public relations, and now ran social media campaigns for wealthy clients. She was good at it, I had to admit. She knew exactly how to present herself, how to make people feel important, how to say all the right things. Tonight she was the perfect bride. Gracious, radiant, Everything a rich family would want in a daughter-in-law. But I knew the real Sarah. The one who'd called me crying when her college rent was due. The one who'd moved back home for 8 months after a disastrous relationship in her 20s. The one who'd sat by Frank's bedside during his final weeks, holding his hand and promising to take care of me after he was gone. Or so I'd thought. During the father-daughter dance they played The Way You Look Tonight, Frank's favorite song. Sarah danced with Michael instead, since Frank wasn't there to twirl her around one last time. I watched her smile and laugh, apparently unbothered by his absence. When the song ended, she didn't even glance toward the empty chair where I'd placed his photo. That's when I knew. I had to read Frank's letter. Not to hurt Sarah, but to understand what had happened to the daughter I thought I knew. I slipped away during the dancing, finding a quiet corner in the mansion's library. The Ashfords probably had more books than our entire town library, though I suspected most of them were for show. I pulled out the envelope Frank had given me. His handwriting shaky but still recognizable across the front. For Dorothy, only if you need it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Frank's careful script. The date at the top showed he'd written it just 3 days before he died. My dearest Dot, it began. If you're reading this, it means Sarah has shown you who she's become, not who she used to be. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know this will hurt, but you need to know what I observed during my final weeks. My heart was already racing, but I forced myself to keep reading. Sarah has been different since she started seeing Michael. Not just happy different, but calculated different. She's been asking questions about our finances, about my will, about what would happen to you after I'm gone. When I asked why, she said she was worried about your future, but I've been watching her. And I don't think worry is the right word. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. Yesterday, she brought me papers from something called Meadowbrook Manor, an assisted living facility. She said she'd been researching options for your future, places where you could be properly cared for after I died. She had brochures, pricing information, even a waiting list application. When I asked her why she thought you'd need assisted living at 68, she said it was just planning ahead. The letter continued for another page, each observation more devastating than the last. Frank describing Sarah's increasing impatience with his medical needs. Her comments about how expensive my medications were becoming. Her suggestions that perhaps I was getting too old to live alone safely. I changed my will. Everything goes to you now, with instructions that she can't contest. But more than that, I want you to know that the daughter we raised is still in there somewhere. She's just lost her way. Don't let her convince you that you're a burden. You're the best thing I ever did with my life. And if she can't see that, it's her loss, not yours. The letter was signed simply, "Forever yours, Frank," with a postscript that made my hand shake. P.S. I saw the Meadowbrook Manor brochure in her purse again today. She's planning something. Don't let her do it. When I finished reading, I sat in that elegant library, surrounded by books that probably cost more than most people's cars. And I finally understood why Frank had made me promise to use this letter if I needed to. He'd spent his final days not just fighting cancer, but protecting me from a daughter who saw his death as an opportunity rather than a loss. I rejoined the reception with Frank's words echoing in my mind. His letter hadn't contained shocking revelations or complex investigations, just the careful observations of a dying man who'd noticed his daughter's growing coldness and selfishness. But those simple observations painted a picture that broke my heart. Sarah hadn't suddenly turned cruel. She'd been planning my future without consulting me, researching ways to have me declared incompetent or unsafe to live alone. Frank had seen it happening and tried to warn me the only way he could. I watched Sarah accept congratulations from the guests, her smile bright and practiced. But now I could see what Frank had noticed. The way she calculated each interaction, the slight impatience when someone took too long to make their point, the careful way she steered conversations away from anything that might reflect poorly on her new status. "Mrs. Williams?" A young man appeared at my elbow, one of Michael's cousins whose name I'd forgotten. "Michael wanted me to make sure you were enjoying yourself. Can I get you anything?" I smiled politely. "I'm fine, thank you. It's a beautiful wedding. The Ashford family certainly knows how to throw a party," he agreed, then lowered his voice. "Though between you and me, it's nice to see Michael settling down with someone so practical. After some of the socialites he used to date, Sarah seems refreshingly down to earth. Practical. Down to earth. If only he knew what my down-to-earth daughter was planning for my immediate future. I thanked him and moved away, needing space to think. The irony was overwhelming. Here was Sarah, desperate to become part of high society, surrounded by people who appreciated her for the very qualities she was trying to shed. Her work ethic, her intelligence, her ability to connect with people. All things she'd learned growing up in a modest household with parents who valued character over status. But Frank's letter had revealed something else. Sarah wasn't just trying to fit in with the Ashfords. She was actively trying to distance herself from everything that reminded her of her origins, including me. I found myself studying the other guests with new eyes. The women Patricia's age moved through the crowd with the confidence of people who'd never doubted their place in the world. They had the kind of security that comes from generational wealth, from never having to worry about mortgage payments or whether you could afford to retire. That's what Sarah wanted. Not just money, but the peace of mind that comes with never having to think about money. And in her mind, taking care of an aging mother was a liability that threatened that security. The reception was winding down, but I knew the real evening was just beginning. Frank had given me more than just his observations about Sarah's plans. He'd given me permission to fight back if I needed to, and as I watched my daughter play her role as the perfect bride, I began to understand that I was going to need that permission. During the bouquet toss, Sarah looked directly at me and smiled. It was the first genuine attention she'd paid me all evening, and for a moment I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe Frank had been wrong. Maybe his illness had made him suspicious of innocent behavior. Then I heard her conversation with Patricia as they stood near me afterward. "Thank goodness that tradition is over," Sarah said, adjusting her veil. "I was worried some desperate woman would knock you over trying to catch it." Patricia laughed. "Well, at least your mother didn't try. At her age, remarriage would be rather pathetic, don't you think?" "Oh, Mom's past all that," Sarah replied casually. "She's focusing on more age-appropriate activities now. Quiet hobbies, simple routines. It's probably better for her to accept the limitations that come with getting older." Limitations. At 68, I was supposed to accept limitations and fade quietly into the background while my daughter built her new life? Frank's letter suddenly felt like a lifeline rather than a burden. He'd seen this coming, and he'd tried to protect me the only way he could. I had a choice to make. I could continue being the gracious, unobtrusive mother who didn't embarrass her successful daughter. Or I could remember that I was Dorothy Williams, a woman who'd raised a child, built a career, and supported a husband through cancer treatment. A woman who deserved better than being written off as a pathetic failure by her own daughter. The next morning, I drove back to Hartford with my mind clearer than it had been in months. Frank's letter had given me a different perspective on my recent conversations with Sarah, and I realized I needed to do some research of my own. My first stop? The public library where I'd worked for 30 years. Margaret hugged me warmly when I walked into the library Monday morning. "How was the wedding? I want to hear everything about this fancy family Sarah married into." I'd always liked Margaret's directness. She was 5 years younger than me but had started working at the library the same week I did, fresh out of library school and full of energy. We'd been friends through raises and budget cuts, difficult patrons and technology upgrades that left us both feeling ancient. "It was quite an experience," I said carefully. "Actually, I was hoping you could help me with something. I'm curious about assisted living facilities in Connecticut, particularly one called Meadowbrook Manor." Margaret raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. That was another thing I'd always appreciated about her. She understood that information was power, and sometimes you needed to gather it before you knew exactly how you'd use it. An hour later, we'd compiled quite a file from public records and online reviews. Meadowbrook Manor was indeed exclusive and expensive, but it had something else that caught my attention. A program for asset protection that allowed residents to sign over their estates in exchange for guaranteed lifetime care. More interesting was what we found in the online reviews. Several families had complained about high-pressure sales tactics, about feeling rushed into decisions during emotional periods following a spouse's death. The state had investigated the facility twice in the past 5 years for inappropriate marketing to vulnerable seniors. "Well," Margaret said, printing out the last of our research, "this place certainly seems aggressive about acquiring new residents. and their asset protection program looks designed to separate seniors from their money. I thanked Margaret and drove home with a box full of documents that painted a very different picture of Meadowbrook Manor than Sarah's brochures had suggested. But more than that, I had a plan forming in my mind. Frank's letter was just the beginning. What I needed now was to understand exactly what Sarah was planning and why. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Sarah's college roommate, Jennifer, who'd been at the wedding and had always been more forthcoming than Sarah about family gossip. Under the guise of wanting to send a proper thank you note to the Ashfords, I asked some casual questions about the family's background. What I learned was enlightening. The Ashfords were indeed wealthy, but their money was relatively new. Michael's grandfather had made his fortune in manufacturing after World War II. Patricia had married into the family 30 years ago, and according to Jennifer's gossipy sources, she'd spent those decades carefully crafting their social position. "Sarah's so lucky," Jennifer confided. "Patricia's been taking her to all the right charity events, introducing her to the right people. She's already talking about getting Sarah onto some museum boards." After hanging up, I sat in my small apartment and thought about what I'd learned. Sarah wasn't just marrying into money. She was marrying into a social climbing project that had been going on for decades. And Patricia saw Sarah as a useful tool in that project. Someone young, educated, and presentable enough to help maintain their position in Connecticut society. But that still didn't explain Sarah's plans for me, until I remembered something Frank had mentioned in his letter. Sarah's increasing impatience with the cost of things. My medications, my apartment rent, the small expenses that came with having an aging parent. I pulled out my checkbook and looked at the records from the past year. Sarah had been right about one thing. My expenses had increased. New medications for my arthritis, higher insurance premiums, the cost of having my apartment painted when the management company raised the rent. Nothing dramatic, but the kind of steady increase that comes with aging. Then I realized what Sarah was really afraid of. It wasn't that I needed assisted living now. It was that I might need expensive care in the future. And if I spent down my savings on long-term care, there would be nothing left for her to inherit. Frank's letter had been about protecting me from Sarah's immediate plans. But my own research had revealed something even more disturbing. My daughter saw me not as a person with needs and feelings, but as a financial liability that needed to be managed efficiently. That night, I made a decision that would have shocked the old Dorothy. I wasn't going to wait for Sarah to make the next move. I was going to find out exactly what she was planning, and then I was going to decide what to do about it. 2 weeks after the wedding, Sarah called to invite me to lunch. She sounded unusually warm and friendly, which immediately put me on alert. Sarah was never warm and friendly unless she wanted something. And after Frank's letter, I had a pretty good idea what that something might be. We met at a trendy bistro in West Hartford, the kind of place that served small portions on large plates and charged accordingly. Sarah looked radiant, still glowing from her honeymoon in Italy. She'd always photographed well, but marriage to Michael had given her a new confidence that was almost blinding. "Mom, you look tired," she said, kissing my cheek before we sat down. "Are you sleeping okay, eating enough? I've been worried about you living alone in that little apartment." I ordered a salad and listened to her talk about the honeymoon, about Michael's family's vacation home in the Hamptons, about the charity boards Patricia was helping her join. It was like listening to someone describe a life from a magazine. All perfectly arranged details designed to impress. Finally, after we'd ordered coffee and dessert, Sarah got to the point. "Mom, Michael and I have been talking, and we're concerned about your future. That apartment you're renting is so small, and the neighborhood isn't getting any safer. We think it's time you considered moving somewhere more appropriate for someone your age." "Appropriate?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Well, secure, with medical services nearby. Maybe some social activities." Sarah smiled brightly. "Patricia knows about this wonderful senior community about an hour from our house. Very exclusive, very nice. The waiting list is usually years long, but they have a spot opening up next month." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "Senior community, Sarah? I'm perfectly capable of living independently." "Of course you are now, but it's about planning ahead. And honestly, it would give us all peace of mind to know you're somewhere safe." Sarah reached across the table and patted my hand. "The best part is, you wouldn't have to worry about finances anymore. They have a program where you can transfer your assets, and they guarantee care for life. There it was. The asset protection program I'd researched with Margaret. Sarah wanted me to sign over my inheritance, my savings, everything Frank had left me, in exchange for a room in an institution where she could visit occasionally and feel virtuous about taking care of her mother. That's very thoughtful, I said slowly, but I'm not ready to make that kind of decision yet. I'm enjoying my independence. Sarah's smile tightened slightly. Mom, I understand that it's hard to admit when you might need help in the future. But Dad's been gone for 3 years now. You can't keep pretending you can handle everything on your own indefinitely. I'm not pretending anything, Sarah. I'm managing just fine. Are you? Sarah's voice took on a sharper edge. Because I've noticed you seem a bit scattered lately. Forgetting appointments, missing calls. Patricia mentioned that you seemed confused at the wedding. Out of place. I felt a flash of anger. I seemed confused because I was listening to you call me a pathetic failure. That tends to be disorienting. Sarah blinked, clearly not expecting me to confront her so directly. I never said that. You told Patricia I was a pathetic failure who'd never accomplished anything worthwhile. You said working at the library for 30 years was depressing. I kept my voice level. I heard you, Sarah. That's not. You're taking things out of context. Sarah looked genuinely flustered for the first time. I was just trying to reassure her that you weren't going to be demanding or difficult by calling me a failure, by explaining that you have realistic expectations about your place in our lives going forward. Sarah's mask was slipping, revealing the calculation underneath. Mom, this isn't about what you overheard. This is about being practical. You're 68 years old. You need to start planning for the future. I signaled for the check and started gathering my purse. Sarah, I am planning for the future. I'm planning to live my life on my own terms for as long as I'm able. And when you're not able, when you fall and break a hip or have a stroke or develop dementia, who do you think is going to take care of you? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the heart of it. Sarah wasn't worried about my current needs. She was terrified of my future needs. She wanted me safely warehoused where my aging wouldn't inconvenience her new life. I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, I said. But Sarah, when that time comes, I hope I'll still have a daughter who sees me as a person worth caring about, not just a problem to be solved. As I drove home, I thought about Frank's final gift to me. Not just the letter warning me about Sarah's plans, but the knowledge that he'd seen our daughter's transformation happening and had tried to protect me from it. Sarah thought she was maneuvering me into a corner. What she didn't realize was that she was actually revealing exactly how far she was willing to go to protect her new status. A month after Sarah's lunch invitation, she called again. This time I could hear voices in the background, and the formal tone in her voice told me she was performing for an audience. Mom, we need to talk. Can you come over this evening? Michael and I have some family business to discuss with you. I agreed, though I suspected I knew exactly what kind of family business they had in mind. I spent the afternoon preparing, rereading Frank's letter, and making sure I understood exactly what I was walking into. Sarah and Michael's house in West Hartford was everything she'd always dreamed of. Colonial style, perfectly landscaped, in a neighborhood where the median income required 2 professional salaries and significant family money. Sarah had posted dozens of photos of it on social media, showcasing each room like a magazine spread. When I arrived, I found Sarah, Michael, and Patricia waiting in the formal living room. The staging was deliberate, with me seated alone on one side while the 3 of them faced me from the sofa. It felt like an intervention, which I suppose it was. Dorothy, Patricia began, her voice warm but authoritative. We wanted to talk to you about some concerns we've all been having. Sarah jumped in. Mom, you've seemed more forgetful lately. Missing appointments, not returning calls promptly. Small things, but they're adding up. Michael nodded gravely. We think you might be experiencing some early cognitive changes. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it's something we need to address proactively. I listened to their carefully rehearsed presentation with growing understanding. They'd constructed a narrative about my declining mental health. But unlike the fabricated examples I might have expected, these were subtle distortions of normal behavior. The missed appointment had been rescheduled by me due to a conflict. The unreturned calls were from telemarketers and Sarah's friend Jennifer, not urgent communications. The good news, Patricia continued, is that we've been able to secure you a place at Meadowbrook Manor. They have an opening next week, and we can arrange the transition quickly. All you need to do is sign these papers, Michael said, pulling out a folder of documents. Power of attorney, asset transfer agreements, healthcare directives, everything to make the transition smooth and protect your interests. I looked at the three of them, these people who thought they could manipulate me into signing away my life with exaggerated concerns about my mental capacity. Sarah sat there nodding encouragingly, playing the role of the concerned daughter while planning to inherit everything her father had left me. This is quite a production, I said finally. How long have you been planning this intervention? Sarah's smile faltered slightly. Mom, this isn't a production. We're genuinely worried about you, are you? I pulled out Frank's letter, the envelope worn from being carried in my purse for weeks. Because I have something I think you'll all find interesting. I unfolded the single sheet of paper and began to read aloud Frank's careful observations about Sarah's questions concerning my finances, her research into assisted living facilities, her growing impatience with the costs of having an aging mother. She brought me papers from something called Meadowbrook Manor. I read. An assisted living facility. She said she'd been researching options for your future. Places where you could be properly cared for after I died. Sarah went completely white. Michael frowned in confusion. Patricia's composed expression didn't change, but I saw her hands clenched slightly in her lap. When I asked her why she thought you'd need assisted living at 68, she said it was just planning ahead. I continued. But I've been watching her, and I don't think planning is the right word. As Frank's letter continued, detailing his observations about Sarah's calculated approach to my future care, I watched my daughter's face cycle through shock, panic, and finally, a cold calculation I'd never seen before. When I finished reading, the silence in the room was absolute. Then Michael spoke. Sarah, is this true? Were you researching assisted living facilities while your father was dying? That's when I realized this confrontation was just the beginning of something much larger. That letter proves nothing, Sarah said, but her voice shook. Dad was sick, probably confused. He was seeing problems that weren't there. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my purse. Your father was many things, Sarah, but confused wasn't one of them, especially not about something this important. Michael was studying the documents on the coffee table. The power of attorney forms, the asset transfer agreements, the Meadowbrook Manor paperwork. Sarah, when exactly did you start researching this place? I was just being prepared, Sarah said defensively. Someone had to think ahead about Mom's future needs. While your father was dying of cancer? Michael's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it I hadn't heard before. You were planning to move your mother into assisted living, while he was fighting for his life. Patricia tried to intervene. Michael, I think we should focus on Dorothy's current situation rather than relitigating past decisions. Should we? I asked, turning to Patricia with interest, because I did some research of my own after Sarah mentioned Meadowbrook Manor. Did you know they've been investigated twice by the state for aggressive marketing to vulnerable seniors? For the first time since I'd known her, Patricia looked genuinely uncomfortable. I'm sure any successful facility faces occasional regulatory reviews. Occasional reviews about pressuring grieving widows to sign over their assets immediately after their husbands' deaths? I pulled out the folder of public records Margaret had helped me compile. Because that's what the state found. High-pressure tactics, rushed decisions, families who felt manipulated into making permanent choices during temporary emotional crises. Sarah grabbed for the papers. Where did you get these? Public records, Sarah. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look. I kept the documents out of her reach. The state licensing board, consumer protection agencies, online review sites, all freely available to anyone who bothers to investigate before signing their life away. Michael was reading over my shoulder now. Jesus, look at these complaints. Felt pressure to decide immediately. High-pressure sales presentation. Regretted signing asset transfer agreement. Sarah, did you actually research this place? Or did someone recommend it to you? The silence that followed was telling. Finally, Patricia spoke. I may have mentioned that they had an excellent reputation in certain circles. Certain circles being wealthy. Families looking to warehouse inconvenient relatives. I asked mildly. That's a terrible thing to say, Sarah snapped. We're trying to ensure you get proper care. No, you're trying to ensure I don't become a financial burden on your new lifestyle. I stood up, feeling calmer than I had in months. The difference is that proper care considers what I want, not just what's convenient for you. Michael was still studying the complaint documents. Mom, some of these families sued Meadowbrook. They accused the facility of elder abuse, of manipulating seniors into signing over assets they didn't understand. Patricia's composure was finally starting to crack. Those are isolated incidents. Every industry has a few bad actors. Are they? I asked. Because according to these records, Meadowbrook has a specific program targeting recent widows. They market to families during funeral planning, offer estate protection services, provide referrals through certain funeral homes and lawyers. I watched the three of them process this information. Sarah looked like she was going to be sick. Michael was angry, though I wasn't sure if it was directed at his wife or his mother. Patricia was calculating, probably trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Even if the facility has some problems, Sarah said desperately, that doesn't change the fact that you need to plan for your future. You can't live alone forever, Mom. Why not? I asked. I'm 68, not 88. I'm healthy, mentally sharp, and perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my living situation. But what if something happens? What if you fall or get sick or need help? Sarah's voice was rising. You can't expect us to drop everything and take care of you. There it was, the real fear underneath all the concern about my welfare. Sarah wasn't worried about my current needs. She was terrified that my future needs might interfere with her carefully planned new life. I'm not expecting you to take care of me, Sarah. I'm expecting you to respect my right to make my own choices about how I want to live. Those choices affect other people, Patricia said sharply. Family decisions should be made collectively, considering everyone's interests. Everyone's interests, I repeated. And what exactly are your interests in this situation, Patricia? Patricia straightened in her chair, her social mask firmly back in place. My interest is in seeing this family function harmoniously. Sarah is my daughter-in-law now, and that makes her welfare my concern. And my welfare? Does that concern you at all? Of course it does. Which is why we think Meadowbrook would be perfect for you. You'd have security, medical care nearby, social activities with people your own age. I had to admire her persistence. Even caught recommending a facility with a questionable reputation, she was still trying to sell me on the benefits of institutional living. Patricia, I said gently, I spent 30 years working at a public library. Do you know what that taught me? How to research things thoroughly, how to spot inconsistencies in people's stories, and how to help people find the information they need to make good decisions. Michael looked up from the complaint documents. What kind of inconsistencies? Well, for instance, when someone recommends a specific facility they claim to have researched, but all their information comes from marketing materials rather than independent sources. I looked directly at Patricia. Or when someone is very eager to see a particular outcome, but can't explain why that outcome is important to them personally. Sarah tried to regain control of the conversation. Mom, you're being paranoid. We're trying to help you, are you? Because help usually involves asking what the person wants, not telling them what they're going to do. I sat back down, feeling like I was finally getting somewhere. Sarah, in all these conversations about my future, have you ever asked me what I actually want? Of course, we want what's best for you. That's not what I asked. Have you asked me what I want? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Michael spoke. What do you want, Dorothy? I want to live in my own apartment for as long as I'm able. I want to make my own decisions about my healthcare, my finances, and my social life. I want to be treated like a competent adult, not a problem to be managed. I paused, looking at each of them. And I want my daughter to see me as a person worth respecting, not just an obligation to be discharged efficiently. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I do respect you. I'm scared, Mom. I'm scared something will happen to you and I won't know how to handle it. For the first time all evening, I heard something genuine in her voice. Sarah, being scared is normal. But being scared doesn't justify trying to control someone else's life. I'm not trying to control your life. I'm trying to protect you from what? From making my own mistakes? From living independently? From having the dignity of making my own choices? I reached across and took her hand. Sweetheart, I've been taking care of myself for 68 years. I raised you. I supported your father through cancer. I managed a library budget and staff. Why do you suddenly think I'm incapable of managing my own life? Michael was nodding slowly. She has a point, Sarah. Your mother seems pretty sharp to me. Patricia tried one more time. But the financial protections at Meadowbrook are designed to protect the facility's revenue stream, not the residents' interests, I interrupted. Patricia, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. I can read financial documents, and I can spot a bad deal when I see one. Sarah wiped her eyes with her napkin. So what happens now? You just go back to your apartment and pretend this never happened. I go back to my apartment and continue living my life. You go back to yours and stop trying to manage mine. I gathered my purse and stood up. And maybe if you can learn to see me as an equal rather than a dependent, we can rebuild some kind of relationship. But what if you do need help someday? Sarah asked. Then I'll ask for it. And if you're willing to provide it respectfully, without trying to take over my life, maybe we can work something out. I paused at the door. But Sarah, if I ever need care, it will be my decision how to handle it. Not yours, not Patricia's, not some facility that sees me as a source of revenue. As I drove home, I realized that the evening had gone better than I'd expected. Frank's letter had given me the ammunition I needed, but my own research had given me something more valuable. The knowledge that I was right to resist their pressure. More importantly, I'd seen a glimpse of the real Sarah underneath all the calculation. A young woman who was genuinely scared of the responsibilities that came with having aging parents. 3 weeks later, Sarah called to ask if we could have coffee. Just the two of us, she said. No Michael, no Patricia, no agenda about my living situation. I was skeptical but curious enough to agree. We met at a small cafe near the library. Neutral territory where neither of us had the advantage. Sarah looked different, tired, less polished than usual. Her perfect composure had cracks in it that I'd never seen before. I've been thinking about what you said, she began without preamble. About not asking what you wanted, about treating you like a problem instead of a person. I waited curious to see where this was going. I talked to a therapist about it, about why I was so fixated on getting you into that place. Sarah's hands were wrapped around her coffee cup like she was trying to warm herself. She asked me when I started being afraid of you getting older. And when Dad got sick. When I realized that loving someone doesn't protect them from aging or dying or needing help. Tears started forming in her eyes. I watched you take care of him, and I thought about how someday someone would have to take care of you, and I panicked. This was more honesty than I'd heard from Sarah in years. Why did that scare you so much? Because I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I was strong enough or patient enough or good enough to take care of you the way you took care of him. Her voice broke completely. So, I convinced myself that the solution was to find someone else to do it. Someone professional, someone better at caregiving than me. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Sarah, no one expects you to be a professional caregiver. But what if you need help? Real help, not just emotional support. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed much younger than her 32 years. What if you get sick like Dad did? Then we'll figure it out together. But that doesn't mean signing over my independence now just because something might happen later. I know that now. The therapist explained the difference between planning for possible futures and trying to control them. Sarah wiped her eyes with her napkin. She also pointed out that I was treating you like you were already incapacitated, instead of like someone who could participate in planning for her own future. We sat in silence for several minutes. I thought about Frank's letter, about the daughter he'd been trying to protect me from, but I could also see the daughter he'd raised. Scared, imperfect, but capable of growth. What about Patricia? I asked. And Michael? Michael was horrified when he really understood what we were planning. He said it reminded him of the way his grandfather's business partners tried to pressure him into selling the company when he got dementia. Sarah managed a weak smile. Apparently, The Ashford family has some experience with people trying to take advantage of vulnerable seniors. And Patricia? Patricia is Patricia. She's convinced this whole thing got blown out of proportion, that we should have just handled the Dorothy situation more quietly. Sarah looked embarrassed. She actually said that. The Dorothy situation. I had to laugh. Well, at least she's consistent. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for calling you a failure. For trying to warehouse you. For treating you like a burden instead of my mother. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. I don't know if I can be the daughter you deserve, but I'd like to try. You don't have to be perfect, Sarah. You just have to see me as a person. I squeezed her hand. And maybe ask my opinion before making major decisions about my life. Deal. But Mom, if you ever do need help, real help, not just the normal stuff that comes with aging, will you tell me? Will you let me be part of the solution instead of shutting me out? I considered this carefully. The old Dorothy would have promised to handle everything herself, to never be a burden. But Frank's letter had taught me something about the cost of protecting people from difficult truths. I'll tell you, I said finally. But Sarah, being part of the solution means respecting my choices, even if they're not the choices you would make. I understand. As we prepared to leave, Sarah hesitated. Mom, there's something else about Dad's letter. I tensed, wondering if she was going to challenge its authenticity or accuse me of manipulating his words. I'm glad he wrote it. Not because of what it said about me, but because it meant he was still protecting you even after he was gone. Her voice was soft. I hope someday I'll be smart enough to love someone that completely. Driving home, I realized that the woman I'd raised was still there underneath all the fear and calculation. It was going to take time to rebuild our relationship, and it would never be the same as it was before. But maybe with enough honesty and patience it could be something better. 6 months later, I was reading in my favorite chair when my phone rang. It was Sarah calling with what had become our weekly check-in. Not to manage my life or push me toward any particular decision, but just to talk. How was your week? She asked, and I could hear genuine interest in her voice. Good. I had lunch with Margaret. Went to the book club at the library. Started reading that novel you recommended. I settled back in my chair. Oh, and Robert and I went to a concert on Saturday. There was a pause. Robert was still a relatively new development in my life. A retired English professor I'd met at the library's lecture series. We'd been seeing each other for 3 months, taking things slowly and enjoying each other's company. How are things going with him? Sarah asked carefully. Very well. He's intelligent, and he treats me like an adult capable of making my own decisions. I smiled, knowing Sarah would catch the reference to our earlier conversations. Amazing how refreshing that can be. You deserve that, Sarah laughed. But seriously, I'm glad you're happy. You deserve someone who appreciates you. This was still new territory for us. Sarah showing genuine interest in my happiness rather than just my welfare. The therapy was helping, but more than that, she seemed to be discovering that having a mother with an independent life was actually more interesting than having one who existed solely to be managed. Speaking of appreciation, I said. How are things with Michael and Patricia? Michael's good. He's been asking more questions about my family, about you and Dad. I think meeting you made him realize that not all mothers-in-law are like his mother. Sarah's voice got quieter. Patricia is adjusting. She stopped mentioning assisted living facilities at least. That's progress. She asked me last week if you were still harboring resentment about the Meadowbrook situation. I told her that you weren't harboring anything. You'd simply learn to be more careful about trusting her judgment. I laughed. I bet that went over well. About as well as you'd expect. But Michael backed me up, which was good. He pointed out that trust has to be earned back after it's been broken. We talked for another 20 minutes about books, about Sarah's work, about Robert's grandchildren and their upcoming visit. Normal family conversation, the kind we hadn't had in years. When we hung up, I realized how much I'd missed this version of my daughter. The next morning, I was surprised to get a call from Michael. Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I wanted to ask you something. Of course, what's on your mind? I've been thinking about what happened last year with the whole Meadowbrook situation. I realize I didn't handle it very well. I let my mother push an agenda that wasn't in your best interests. I waited, curious where this was going. I wanted you to know that Sarah and I have talked about it extensively. We've agreed that any future decisions about family matters will include you as an equal participant, not just someone whose life gets planned by other people. I appreciate that, Michael. There's something else. Sarah mentioned that you might be interested in traveling more now that you're not worried about us pressuring you into assisted living. This was news to me. She did. She said you'd always wanted to see Ireland but never had the chance. Patricia and I are planning a family trip to Europe next spring, and we'd like you to join us as our guest. I was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected invitation. That's very generous, Michael. But before you say no, let me explain. It wouldn't be a family obligation trip where you'd have to keep up with our schedule, or pretend to enjoy activities you don't like. We'd plan some things together, but you'd have plenty of independence to explore on your own. And Patricia is on board with this. Michael laughed. Patricia suggested it, actually. I think she's finally figured out that having a happy, independent mother-in-law reflects better on the family than having one who feels pushed around and resentful. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in the past year. 12 months ago, Sarah had been planning to put me in an institution and take control of my assets. Now, she was encouraging me to travel internationally and including me in family plans as an equal participant. The difference wasn't just in Sarah's attitude. It was in my own willingness to stand up for myself. Frank's letter had given me permission to fight back, but the real change had come from recognizing my own worth and refusing to accept treatment that diminished it. A year later, I was packing for Ireland when Sarah arrived at my apartment with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery. Excited about tomorrow? She asked, settling into the chair across from my sofa. Nervous and excited, I admitted. It's been a long time since I traveled anywhere more exotic than Hartford. You're going to love it. And Mom, I'm really glad you said yes to the trip. I looked up from folding sweaters. Sarah, can I ask you something? Last year when you were so determined to get me into Meadowbrook, were you really worried about my safety? Or were you more worried about the inconvenience of having an aging parent? She was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, both. I was scared something would happen to you, but I was also scared of how that would affect my life with Michael. I wanted the peace of mind that comes with knowing someone else was handling the hard stuff. And now I realize that the hard stuff is part of loving someone. You can't just outsource the difficult parts of relationships and expect the good parts to remain meaningful. She smiled. Besides, you've proven pretty conclusively that you don't need to be handled by anyone. I laughed, thinking about everything that had led us to this point. Frank's letter warning me about Sarah's plans, my research into Meadowbrook Manor, the confrontation in Sarah's living room where I'd finally stood up for myself, the months of therapy and honest conversations that had followed. You know what your father would say about all this? I asked. What? He'd say the best gift he ever gave me wasn't the letter warning me about your plans. It was teaching me that I was worth fighting for. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Oh, I think he'd be proud of both of us. You for standing up for yourself, and me for finally learning to see you as a person instead of a problem. He'd definitely be proud, I agreed, and probably relieved that he doesn't have to haunt Patricia for recommending questionable senior living facilities. We both laughed at that image. Patricia had indeed adjusted her approach to our family dynamics, though I suspected it was more about maintaining her social position than any genuine change of heart. But that was fine with me. I didn't need Patricia to love me. I just needed her to respect my autonomy. Mom, there's something I want to say before you leave for Ireland. I stopped packing and gave her my full attention. Thank you for not giving up on me. When you played Dad's letter that night, you could have just exposed what I was planning and walked away. You could have written me off as a selfish daughter who didn't deserve a relationship with you. I thought about it, I said honestly. But you didn't. You gave me the chance to understand what I'd become and choose to be better. Not everyone would have done that. I sat down next to her on the sofa. Sarah, you're my daughter. Not because you're perfect, but because we're family. Real family doesn't disappear when people make mistakes. It just requires everyone to work harder at being honest with each other. I love you, Mom. Not for what you can do for me or what you represent in my life, but because you're Dorothy Williams, A woman who worked for 30 years at a job she loved, who raised a difficult daughter with patience and grace, and who had the courage to fight for her own dignity when everyone around her was trying to take it away. As we hugged goodbye, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. The pain of hearing my daughter call me a pathetic failure. The fear of losing my independence to someone else's convenience. The discovery that I was stronger and more valuable than I'd allowed myself to believe. Frank's letter had started it all. But the real victory had been learning to see myself the way he'd always seen me. As a person worth respecting, worth fighting for, worth loving exactly as I was. Tomorrow I board a plane for Ireland. Not as a burden being managed by my family, but as Dorothy Williams, a 69-year-old woman embarking on an adventure she dreamed about for decades. Some victories don't come with fanfare or celebration. Sometimes the greatest triumph is simply the quiet satisfaction of knowing you refused to disappear when everyone around you was trying to make you invisible. And that, I thought as I finished packing, was exactly the kind of legacy Frank would have wanted me to create. So tell me, have you ever had to fight for your own dignity, even against the people you love? What would you have done in my place? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts down in the comments below.